Well, howdy again. This is John Somerville with Zion's Watchman. Zion's Watchman analyzes incidents that are going on around the world, and as a watchman used to do in the old days, they'd be up on the city walls, and when they saw danger coming, they would alert their community. And when danger comes to either our nation or to the nation of Israel, that's what Zion's Watchman attempts to proclaim what is going on out there and perhaps estimate what the future consequences are going to be. Gary, tell these folks what Ezra International does and what your role with them is.
All right, thank you, John. I am Gary Cristofaro, and I'm the Director of Development for Ezra International. Ezra International's primary focus is to help the poorest of the poor Jewish people get home from the nations that they have been scattered, getting them home to Israel, giving them new hope and a new life.
Well, I recently had the great opportunity to be with Gary in the nation of Ukraine, and it fulfilled a desire of mine to go and to see in Eastern Europe where so many of these things that has in modern times kind of led to the formation of the nation of Israel, because so many of the Jews that lived in that area, not only Ukraine, but in Russia and in Poland, this was known as the Pale of Settlement. And Pale of Settlement never meant very much to me. I mean, people would say to me, boy, you're really out of the pale. And I thought they meant the kind you used to carry milk around in. But Pale, P-A-L-E, of settlement was an Old English word, and it comes from palus, or a stake. A stake was put in the ground marking a boundary, and it was within this boundary, this massive boundary, that Jews were often herded into. At times they were invited in. Over the years, it was different ways and reasons why the Jews came in, and we're talking back in the 13th and 14th century. But coming up to modern times, they were captive in the Pale of Settlement, and Ukraine was one of those countries. And Ukraine has a very interesting background to it. And as happened to Jews in the other countries within the Pale, the laws changed on them dramatically at times. And if you've ever had the opportunity to watch the movie Fiddler on the Roof, that shows near the end of the Pale of Settlement when Jews started leaving and were able to leave. Now, in the Ukraine, the seeds of anti-Semitism had been sowed centuries before. And I think in another segment, we're going to talk much more about how all of this came about. Certainly in relatively modern times in the Ukraine, things happened that explain today why it is so difficult for Jews to prove that they're Jews. One of the things that happened was when the Russian Empire disintegrated during World War I, and Lenin came in, and then Stalin. That area split into kind of different countries. And for a period of time, Ukraine was independent of what was the old Russian Empire. But when the communists took over, they wanted to rebuild the great Russian Empire, and they started bringing and forcing these countries back under their control. And one of the things they did, starting in 1917, almost up until modern times, was communism was atheistic. So they wanted to do away with religion. And one of the religions that they were glad to do away with was Judaism. Of course. And so consequently, generation after generation, if there were no synagogues, if there were no rabbis, if there was no one helping these people to understand what their traditional religion was, that religion would go away. And that's what the communists wanted. That's what Satan wanted to start with.
We find that, John, and today when we enter the Jewish home in Ukraine, we find that most of those individuals have had no formal training whatsoever in their roots of their own faith in Judaism. Many of them are very secular in that regard.
Yeah. One of the things I was very surprised about was we went into one Jewish community center and we went into a classroom, and the people in the classroom were well into their 80s and 90s. And when I asked what they were studying, they said, Yiddish. Yiddish. We all thought every Jew could understood Yiddish, and yet here was people who didn't know Yiddish, and in the latter part of their lives, they wanted to learn it because right now they're living under a modicum of freedom that they never had before. Well, one of the things that happened that was so tragic was that Kiev was a city, which is the capital of Ukraine today. Kiev was a city with a large population, Jewish population. And when World War II started, most of the men were in the Russian army because this was all part of the Soviet Union. So they were in the Russian army. And as the Nazis, as the German army was penetrating into the Ukraine, the Russian army was retreating. So the Jewish men, for the most part, the fighting men, were gone. What did that leave in the city? That left wives, mothers, children, and elderly men. These were Jews who were undefended when the Nazis came in.
An easy target.
And one of the tragic things that ever happened happened in the city of Kiev. And the Germans took over, and their buildings were mined by the retreating Russians, knowing that the Germans would take over the major and the good buildings. And so when they did, they were blown up. And in retribution, who are you going to blame? You're going to blame the Jews.
Of course.
This is almost always what happens. A message went out all over the city that all Jews were to assemble at a certain crossroads and to bring your winter garments, to bring your suitcases, bring any valuables you have, because the wonderful Germans were going to move them to the east somewhere to protect them and to get them out of the way of the war. And so these people did assemble. And at first there were just some Ukrainian policemen there kind of directing traffic, even though they weren't allowed to drive anything. And they started walking them down a street. And then as they went down this street, German soldiers started appearing, more Ukrainian police, to pretty much so there was no backing out. Then they were told, leave your outer garments here, leave your suitcases here, your names are on them, we will transfer them for you. And then the next thing was, take off all your clothes. Turn all of your jewelry in. And by this time, the Jews were helpless. They were, the Nazis were all around them with guns, and they were marched into a giant ravine in the city. It was called Babi Yar. And Babi Yar refers to the grandmother's ravine. Now, why it was named that, I don't know. But as these people were marched into it, they were shooting them and they were dropping into this ravine. And then more were marched in. And then soldiers and Ukrainians would jump down into the pit, make sure nobody was still alive, and they'd shoot them in the head again. The bodies started piling up. Gary, in 2 days, 34,000 Jews were murdered in that one ravine. And we had the horrific privilege of going there.
Yeah.
And
it's, John, when you mentioned Babi Yar, it may be one of the most tragic days in Jewish history, or a couple of days, along with the most tragic time in Jewish history, the Holocaust. And it really reminds me of part of my motivation to do what we do, what I do with Ezra International, and what we do as an organization, because there's a quote of a righteous Gentile named Imre Pathori. He's a Hungarian righteous Gentile, and if you go through Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum in Israel, in Jerusalem, you'll see this quote. And it really is appropriate when it comes to the killing pits of Babi Yar. He says, when I go before God on Judgment Day, I will not be asked the question posed to Cain, where were you when your brother's blood was crying out to God? That is our call. That blood from the pits of Babi Yar is still calling out to us today, John. It's still calling out to righteous Gentiles worldwide, because we can do something about the current situation. We can't go back and change the past, but we can do something about this anti-Semitism that's sweeping the globe, the threat that the Jewish people are under today. You know, I often say, we really can't say never again. Not truly say never again. As long as Jewish people are trapped by poverty in notoriously anti-Semitic countries, they need our help. They will not get out without the help that Ezra International and our donors provide.
I think that one thing that history teaches is that historical precedents occur again and again. People say, well, history repeats itself. There's no doubt about that if you study history. And there's no doubt that what is going on in some of these countries that are being sealed off again, just imagine if as many people that we met in Ukraine told us they believe the Russians are going to attack again and take over half of the country. That means people really have to fear and run for their lives. Mm-hmm. And we saw some of these families. We met some of these families. I appreciate you introducing me to them. They left with nothing just to get away. If Russia comes in and takes over half of that country, it's untold numbers of Jews who will again be in jeopardy. Who's behind all of this? Look, let's take a look. It's spiritual. It's satanic.
It is.
And it's always Satan out to stop what God's plan is. He won't. But we would have no excuse of saying, gee, we didn't know.
That's right.
You know, and
That's
we thought the Holocaust, that happened somewhere in ancient history. It wasn't ancient history. Many of us were even alive during those times. We can think back to that time. And you know who was not there to help them during that time? The church was not there to help them.
That's right. Sadly, they weren't.
Yeah.
In fact, many of the stories are told of the boxcars going down the tracks, loaded with Jewish people on their way to the death camps, while the church sang their songs. And if the trains and the moaning and the screaming was getting to be annoying, they just played the music a little louder. And that just cannot happen again, John.
We won't let it happen again. And we are people who stand up and speak out, and we're speaking out against this. And there are many of you who God is touching your heart to join with us and to speak out in these issues. These things that we talked about, that's not only ancient history. That can be a predecessor to what's going to happen. And we can do something about it and not let it happen again and save as many as we possibly can by sounding this warning and by doing the deeds of helping these people make Aliyah and to get out to the one safe refuge they have in all the world, and that's the state of Israel.
Amen. You know, John, you mentioned the Pale of Settlements and some other topics that I think would be best illustrated by the map room. Why don't we go there next?
Let's get down.
Okay.
Well, here we are in the map room again. This is the exciting part of the day for me.
Sure.
And this map is Central Europe, kind of Central Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
And it shows a lot of countries that I believe Ezra International is involved with.
When I look at that map, I see a few. It's not all inclusive, of course, but on this map we have Poland, and we have Ukraine and Moldova, Hungary we're in. And what's important to understand about this dynamic, especially today, is that we're also in Russia. We're in Russia, and of course, the war has gone on now for 3 years between Ukraine and Russia. That makes for an interesting mix for our people on the ground as they do the job in these two countries.
Yeah, you know, Russia's kind of the 800-pound bear in the room that nobody wants to talk about. Yeah. Let's take a look over here at what we know that Russia has been doing the last few years. They've been active. They're not just sitting on what were the former borders at all. Yeah. And for the most part, we haven't paid attention. The United States didn't pay attention. Our administration kind of shrugged, and because they moved into the places like Abkhazia. Well, they're hard for us to even say. And but they say, well, there's Russian speakers there, so that's very important. And then into Georgia around the time of the Winter Olympics, and they didn't pull back. And then I think the one place that we're most familiar with is the Crimea. Yeah. And they took over the Crimea without a shot being fired for the most part.
And that created an interesting dynamic for us, for our viewers to understand that with the Aliyah, that overnight our Olim had to go from Ukrainian passports to Russian passports. And so thank God we work in both countries.
Yeah. So let's look at another map and see how the Russians really did this.
Yeah, and that one I think is right behind you, isn't it?
Oh, it is. I love this map right here. Well, Gary, this map kind of shows the opposing forces that happened as the Russians or the Russian pseudo soldiers, sympathizers, took over parts of Kiev and the southeastern corner.
Right.
Now, I know this map shows Lviv up in the northwestern corner. What happened there recently?
Well, that kind of typifies the problem that's happening for the Jewish people. In the east, you have the Russian invasion that's causing a problem. In Lviv, we recently had, it was this past summer, more incidents of anti-Semitism. A synagogue in Lviv was actually, the attempt was to firebomb it, a Molotov cocktail to go through the windows. And there was graffiti on the synagogue referencing back in 1941 when 7,000 Jewish people were killed in that city. So you see how the Jewish people are squeezed from both sides by the ultranationalists and by the Russian separatists.
Now the colors on this map show the pink are mostly Russian speakers, and this gives you some idea of what Ukraine is all about. And the yellow part are Ukrainian speakers, and they're kind of ultra-nationalists. And so this leaves the Jews kind of pressed between two opposing forces.
That's right.
And so let's step over and take a look at the next map.
Yes, sure.
Which this is one of my favorites over here, because this illustrates very briefly exactly what Putin did, and he had a precedent. In 1938, there was a guy named Hitler.
That's right.
And Hitler said, I need to go into Czechoslovakia because these are German speakers, they have a German, and I have to go in and protect them. Putin's saying the same thing. There's Russian speakers in there. They love Russia, and I got to go in and protect them. Let's move over to the other map.
Sure, we can do that.
Well, I think this map right here explains the critical importance of Ukraine to the Russian economy and to the Russian president, because they are so reliant on selling oil and gas to Europe. And this shows all of those pipelines going right through the Ukraine. And it's why there's many people in the Ukraine who are convinced Russia is going to attack and take much of the country away from them.
Yeah, they were talking about it when we were there last. So you're absolutely right.
So there's economic and military significance to all of these moves that go on. But you know what's behind it is this craving again to set up this evil empire that Ronald Reagan called the Soviet Empire. And they've never given up that kind of a view of, again, taking over places very much like this. This is... I think it's important to take a look at world maps and try to look at the big moves that are going on and what they mean to the world, but especially what they mean in light of God's Word.
That's right. Yeah, big picture.
Yeah. And the big picture is the calling back of His people to Israel. I think there's going to be a tsunami of Jews coming out of these countries that used to be part of the former Soviet Union because people have not stopped praying for them.
Yeah.
Let's go outside. We've been in the map room quite a bit.
Okay,
yeah.
Okay, let's do that. You know, John, we were talking about being a doer of the word, and I couldn't help but think about this woman we met in Ukraine. You remember the camp we went to when you were?
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
She came up. This camp is for our viewers. This camp is for the refugees who are coming out of the war zone. They're coming out with nothing. They're coming out with the shirts on their back, and we keep them in this camp and we help them, feed them, and clothe them, and get them off to Israel. Well, this woman came to me that time with tears and running down her face, and she says, I can't believe there are people out there that care about us, people who would actually give of their money so that we would have hope. And you know, that's really what it's all about. Is there's so many, there's not just the volunteers and the workers at Ezra on the ground, but people anywhere in the world who could help.
No, that's true, and that is really one of the prime reasons why we asked the question at the beginning of this show, why should you spend your valuable time listening to us? And I believe that is the reason, because you are just not a viewer out there. You can be a doer. And that's kind of taking a Bible verse and changing it around a little bit. Be not only viewers, but be doers of the word. And that's what we talked about earlier too, because it's not only prophecy being fulfilled and you are passive about prophecy, just saying, oh, well, I always wondered when this was going to happen, but the passivity is over. This is time for action, and you can be a part of this. You can help the folks that we are helping in Ukraine, who are out there knocking on doors, doing the paperwork, helping these Jews who can make Aliyah, who can immigrate into Israel because Israel needs them back, and it's part of God's plan that they go back.
Yes, and I like what you said about giving them hope. You know, our in our logo, we talk about rescue, return, restore. That restore is a restoration of hope in their lives. You know, they're at the very bottom. You know, they have nothing. They've lost everything. And when all of a sudden somebody comes along and says, you know, it's not over, you have a chance for a new life in Israel, that hope is restored.
You know what? One of the great blessings in our lives, and I know it happened to you and it's happened to me, when a Jew will come up to us as Christians and say, I never thought that any Christians would ever care about us. Matter of fact, I never thought anybody in the world would care about us.
That's right.
But for you Christians to do that, and I know it reverberates with you as it does with me, it just makes it all worthwhile.
It does. That's what we're here. That's why what we're all about. And for you, EzraInternational.org. Go to our website and check us out. You probably can answer a lot of questions right there on the website, EzraInternational.org.
God bless you, and thank you so much for being with us today. God's got something for you to do. This is not passivity, this is action, and that's what He's calling for now.